We're recording.
All right, this is a container identity working group for Friday, February 23, 2018, and Mike's going to start us off.
Yeah, so the one item that I wanted to discuss seems to be the last outstanding comment on the token request design proposal. It's a bit of a tricky question. The question is, how are we going to expand? The implication of the question is, how are we going to expand token review to support passing audiences to verify tokens for applications that are running on Kubernetes that aren't necessarily the API server. So an example of how someone might use this is Vault might send a token request or a token review for a token that it receives from its API to the Kubernetes API server. The Kubernetes API server verifies the token is valid and hands back a user info struct to Vault. So to decide whether the token is valid, the API server needs to check the audience. So we have to check we have to expand the token review to support passing audiences. So this has a bunch of implications, but I guess we can work our way through them. The first one is we have other Kubernetes components that support token authentication, such as the kubelet extension API servers. So it's unclear to me how we want to assign audience identifiers to these components. Right now, today, it appears that I guess that anybody who does a token review assumes the audience is the API server. I don't know if we want to partition that space up or have conventions around that or allow that to be configured. So what that would mean is, should a token request to a kubelet API server or a kubelet handler, for example, should that have an audience that is scoped down to that specific kubelet? Should it have an audience that is all kubelets? Should have an audience that is the logical API?
So certainly, like anything coexisting on the node with a kubelet right now that has global node permissions breaks like the node authorizer restrictions. And that's definitely something I've started to notice as people are leading on daemon sets for more and more extension type pieces. So like device plugins, the gRPC stuff for CSI. Like those are all examples of things where if those daemon sets have access across all nodes, it kind of breaks the whole point of node isolation. So there's I think we might have a couple of cases there that could guide us at least to maybe a yes on a few of those, on scoping down by default explicitly for things like daemon sets or something.
So specifically for the audience of the kubelet handler, for this example, what audience should the kubelet handler identify as?
So, so Clayton, are you talking about like having sort of per pod identity or per node identity for daemon sets? Because that seems like a different issue.
Well, so the whole point, I think, of the token was to get to the point where we would have a token that represents this pod, not this service account, right? That was a fundamental underpinning bit. I don't know that I want to push really hard like that, but I mean, like like the first person who turns on Node Authorizer and then runs a daemon set has just completely undone all the hard work of Node Authorizer and invalidated that, right? Because they basically go back to the node having full privileges on all.
Well, whatever that daemon set service account has then ends up being
right, which sometimes isn't bad. So again, Joe, maybe I don't.
Yeah, no, I just think that's a separable issue from the audience. The audience is the idea that like when you get a token, it's sort of a poor man's scope, right?
That's fair. And I was thinking along the lines of every daemon set today talks back to the API server as its service account, but in some respects, it's also talking back as that node. And so that's one example. Maybe we don't have to go too far on it, but like it's a very real security concrete step that we could take. I guess
if you're talking back to the API server, the audience is the API server. I think the question is when you're using a token to talk to some system that's not the API server, you have to give that an audience. And
yeah,
so
sorry.
if you're using a token to talk to the kubelet API, do we actually have a single audience across all kubelet APIs, or do we have an audience on a per node basis? I think that's the question.
I was thinking every time someone talks about this problem, they automatically assume that someone's going to go do like a node local cache of the things that the node needs. Like all the CNI plugins do this today that do anything real. They have to go get like all the same data that the kubelet has. And so that's been discussed a couple times. So sorry.
It's totally an issue. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah. I've been thinking of it in the
it's context a different issue.
Talking to the kubelet for the data that the kubelet is authoritative on, rather than talking to the API server for some of these things.
Right. Or you want to talk to Vault, and so you have the Vault audience, or you want to talk to, essentially like as we move authorization from being a star topology with the API server in the middle to being a network of things authenticating against each other. That's really the question. So sorry, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Mike.
Yeah, Mike, to answer your question, I don't know. I mean, we need some scoping mechanism, right? It would be stupid not for us to come up with some scoping. I mean, is there existing art that we can draw from in either Spiffy or in other, scoping around audiences?
I'm not sure. So far, I think Spiffy has not created a JOT ID doc specification yet. So it has all been X509, which does not require the same. It doesn't have the same idea of audience. So they've avoided that problem. Potentially.
Oh, go ahead, Mike. Sorry.
No, I forgot what I was going to say.
Sorry. So I think this is some way similar to like when you're actually doing TLS and you're talking to a server and you actually check out the server ID, whether it be a domain name or some other type of thing. That's to some degree like how do you name the thing that you're talking to, or that this thing is meant to be talked to. So that's one analogy there.
For the kubelet specifically, I don't know. I sort of lean towards being more specific unless there's a reason not to. Like, I think it's nice to, in terms of like a logging, auditing, and what's happening on my cluster perspective, to know that it was this kubelet authenticating. Although actually, I'm not sure.
No, it's saying I want to talk to this kubelet specifically.
I think that's not quite. So the thing we're trying to stop is, so let's say I have a daemon set. I have a pod that talks to the local kubelet to do something to understand that node. Do I want that kubelet to be able to take that token and replay it on another node's kubelet or not?
Yeah.
Which probably we don't want that, but I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think.
So okay, so the other analogy that I was going to bring up here is OAuth2 scopes, right? Because the idea is you get a token for an OAuth2 scope, and that gives you permissions on what you can talk to. And different people have sort of like a huge space of OAuth2 scopes, and other people, they have a set of constants in a file someplace in terms of the scopes they're talking about. And so there's this question of like, do we have one scope for talking to all kubelets, or do we have a scope per kubelet, or do we do both? Right? You could actually have two audiences. One audience says I get to talk to all kubelets, and then another audience is I'm talking to a specific kubelet.
Does this break down from the scope analogy though? Like, should we mentally model audience as a specific scope or not?
I mean, audience is usually, people think about actor, not necessarily capability, or scope is kind of capability, not the thing that you want to be able to identify to, but they are somewhat analogous because who you can talk to in some ways governs what information you can get.
Yeah, I mean, audience is nominally more about the identity of the entity that you're trying to talk to. So do we have a robust idea of kubelet identity?
Yes.
In Kubernetes?
Yes, and
in terms of target and source, right? This is about identity for target.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, if we already have this robust idea of kubelet identity, then it should be straightforward to use that as the audience when people are trying to talk to kubelet.
I mean, certainly I would say, I feel like no matter what we pick for the audience, it is going to be a global namespace that we need to appropriately scope ourselves down in no matter what. And if there isn't a dominant spec for audience, we should pick something that's going to be familiar for the identity side of the house, so that, you know, whether it's TLS identity or whether it's LDAP identity, you know, I don't want to see a bunch of OUs and CNs, but like that mental model of take a global namespace, which is the audience, scope it down as far as we need to leave all the wiggle room we could possibly have, and maybe be as explicit with identity as we can.
So this is an area that Spiffy is working on and has made quite a bit of progress. So you could imagine constructing Spiffy IDs.
That was kind of what I was, I didn't know if a Spiffy ID would be appropriate or not, but something along those lines for totally subdividing the space so that we can say, you know, within, if you come in and the audience looks like a Spiffy ID or whatever, it's very clear, and we leave the room open for, yeah, maybe we get audience wrong, I can come back later, but like at least something that has the concept of progressively finer scopes.
Yeah, that's sort of exactly how Spiffy IDs are set up. That's basically a URL type namespacing.
I mean, are there any disadvantages to something like that, Mike or Matt? Or
I think one other thing one assumption we should clarify is like the domain of this is one cluster. So we could just pick a global namespace and say Spiffy : / Kubernetes / node ID. Or we could say, you know, actually you could have more than one cluster that has the same signing key. You want to have the root of that namespace be a cluster identifier of some kind. That would be a change, but I think we should probably make that explicit. I think it's kind of an assumption right now that a cluster has a signing key or signing keys, and you're sort of talking about, that's sort of the domain you're talking about. But to me, that's also related then to the namespaces we choose for the identifiers.
So it sounds like there are two questions. One, at this point, I feel like the consensus is that each kubelet should have its individual identifier that it validates as the audience of tokens sent to it. The other is what that identifier should be encoded as, and whether we need to prescribe something for that. Potentially a Spiffy ID or something. I can try to write up some notes on that. Maybe we could move on to maybe extension API server as the next example. So right now, extension API servers do delegated authentication back to the main API server. So today, their audience is the audience of the API server. I guess that's true of anybody using token review. Do we want requests to that go directly to API servers, extension API servers, and not through the main API server to require an audience that is bound to that specific API extension server?
If we don't, so I mean, I don't know how far everybody else has gone down this. Like in OpenShift, we have a number of components like extension API servers, kubelets, Prometheus endpoints for a number of like core system components, and proxies that continually bump up against this exact problem of don't train people to give their service account token or their personal token to a bunch of components. I guess maybe like the question we should ask is, if we don't require audience for these distributed components when it's appropriate, people will just go ahead and send their token, which seems bad, right? Like, should we require audience going forward for all components that are using token review?
Yeah, to me, this is way more
clients
clear.
always understand who they're talking to? In this case, with the extension servers, does the client always know? Oh, I'm talking to an extension server. I'm talking to the real API server.
Client might, human almost certainly doesn't.
Wait. So I'm trying to understand the scenario here. So user talks to the API server calls aggregated API server. Is that the idea?
No.
The other one, sorry, yeah. Go ahead, Mike.
Sorry.
So that is one model, where in that model, I would think that the audience is the API server. The second model is talking to the API extension server directly.
So who's going to talk to the API server directly?
So we originally had this discussion and we said that was the original model a very long time ago for aggregated API. And the reason for that is it allows you to completely distribute a large class of things, because basically no matter what, the aggregated API server still has to check authorization for any incoming call. It's just either checking from an upstream or checking from an end user. But then from an operational perspective, as well as a simplicity perspective, we said, well, 99% of the time, the aggregated API is going to make more sense. So I don't think there's a concrete case right now to go talk to that for the extension API servers.
So 2 points here. If you're going through the aggregated API server, what I would imagine is that the user would, when talking to the aggregated API server, the audience would be the API server. The API server, when talking to the upstream aggregated API server, the audience, the identity of the caller then would actually be the API server. The audience would be the upstream aggregated API server, and there'd be another header saying like, here was the original user and group information that was used.
Yeah, that's what we do today with a TLS.
Yeah, and so there's no audience confusion there in terms of being able to, and if you want to do something where you talk to the aggregated API server and then it then talks on your behalf back to the API server, then that's like a scenario for OAuth, right? I mean, because you essentially have another application that's, you know, acting on your behalf, right? So, and I don't think we want to recreate OAuth here.
And another way to frame the extension API server, which is the point of not going through an aggregator, would be because you actually want to invert the model of a fully trusted aggregator. So like today, you can't install a CRD that you can't have two different actors on the same cluster using different CRDs unless you force all the CRD controllers to look at a particular namespace or something. For an aggregated API server, it's even worse. You can't have two different versions of an aggregated API server. You can't test it, et cetera. If we were going to go down the path of just talking to an aggregated API server directly, that is much more of a case of, I doubt they're going to need, they're going to want to get the audience on that, but it's less of a, no, I guess in that case, like, you are going to want to.
I don't think we want to encourage that in any way, shape, or form. I mean, you skip authorization, you skip auditing.
No, you can't skip. That's what I mean is, like, in that model, you would still need an authorization and you really would want an audience. I guess I'm just saying it's not a short-term requirement. It looks more like the other cases of like components in the cluster that aren't aggregated APIs. Metrics is an example for us. So like for us, we have tenant metrics. And so you can't expose tenant metrics unsecured on a port to the internet. So we went down this path of using the token review in front of it. And for now, mostly it's system roles that access that metrics endpoint, in which case token review is okay, but it's still not great. It usually means things like Prometheus need to go get a separate service account token that has more limited rights. And anyone who gets that token can then go scrape any of the other endpoints, which again, for system level, cluster level, things, it's fine, but. What we have another, Mike, what's the other big actor in the system that needed audience? I felt like we had, I thought you mentioned it before.
The main API server, extension APIs, kubelets, and whatever people want to run. So user workload.
Daemon sets and Vault. So per node things, Vault, and then, oh gosh, there's one more.
Well, I think the scenario is a daemon set that wants to talk to a kubelet, right? So how does the daemon set get access to just its paired kubelet and not all kubelets, right? Is that the daemon set?
I think that's sort of a separate problem from how do you when you mint a token to pass to your kubelet, how do you make sure your kubelet doesn't that they can't replay
which
that
comes
token?
down to the audience, right?
Yeah, and actually, I don't think about that more. I don't know if that's that important, because any token that you could possibly mint as a pod, your kubelet could also mint. Right.
It is going to be minting it for you.
Yeah, and in fact, it did mint it for you. So the kubelet's strictly more powerful than any pod on a node. So
I think the idea is
worry about
is that I have some sort of daemon set that's like, say, a storage daemon set, and it wants to talk to some centralized coordinator to do something, and then that thing may in return actually return to me a jot for just my kubelet. So the service account is being sort of filtered through policy from some sort of centralized storage controller versus me talking directly to the API server to get that jot.
But still, however you talk to that storage controller to get that token, the kubelet could have impersonated you and done that.
Right, and so this comes down to the fact of daemon sets do need per pod identity, and so we can't restrict identity just to service accounts, because if we gave each instance of a daemon set its own identity, then that identity can be used by the centralized controller to only ever deliver a jot for the kubelet that's local to the node that particular pod is on.
Isn't that a lot of what we talked about last week? Weren't we?
Yeah, I know that's still.
This was what we talked about.
Erica had a comment in the chat here.
Yeah, I think I agree with Moyer that it's not that concerning. The one concerning thing is if you end up talking to a kubelet that's not your kubelet, and now another kubelet. If all kubelets had the same audience, now kubelet 2 becomes able to impersonate you back to kubelet 1 that you live on. I don't know how concerned we need to be about that.
Well, no, but the threat model here is that a kubelet gets compromised, can capture a jot, and then use that to impersonate you to talk to other kubelets.
But technically, the kubelet can already capture everything that flows on that node. So,
right. Well,
the kubelets that own your pod, it's only when it's another kubelet that you're talking to.
Let's think about a kubelet a kubelet on a rogue node that is also sniffing network traffic is able to. I don't know. It's hard to come up with a practical.
But Clayton. So if we assume that we have per pod identity for like a daemon set, okay?
I think let's assume that. That's a good assumption.
Let's assume we have that, okay? So that means the kubelet can impersonate that particular pod in that daemon set if it gets owned, right? And let's say that identity can then be used to get a jot to talk to its buddy kubelet. Then we're good. Now, if the per pod identity for that daemon set could be used to get a jot that lets you talk to all kubelets, then it becomes an expansion cross node.
Right, and the assumption is that in that case, the person who's getting that identity probably already had that permission to talk to all kubelets. So the controller, like a controller that's running a highly privileged daemon set, in which case it probably lines up still.
But I think the general theme here is that how do we make daemon set pods be less privileged? And to do that, we need to start scoping down all identity to per node basis, which includes the audience. Now, I do want to. So Erica said in the chat here, audience is a specific entity. I think RBAC is a place for grouping permissions, which can then be hierarchical. I think the idea here is that it's not one about sort of permissions. It's really one about, like, if something gets compromised, what's the blast radius, right? So if audience is more general, then you can use that same token to impersonate people, and you can man in the middle. I think that's the threat model here.
One specific case where I could imagine things blowing up is you're getting you're a compromised kubelet. You're getting exec requests from the API server, right? Which have a token. I think that's how those are auth. I think they're usually just cert auth now, but theoretically, you could, if it was token auth, you could sort of replay that exec request onto another node, an exec, where you shouldn't be able to.
So I think for features like this, it's useful to actually sort of really be scenario driven. And I think if we call this least privileged daemon set pods, right? If that's the scenario we're going after, then we should look at sort of the suite of features that we need around that.
I think the Prometheus gathering one is the most concrete one I have today, because we keep hitting it I don't want to encourage people to give their service account tokens or their per pod full identity tokens to something that scrapes on their behalf. So like imagine Prometheus, it has a service account. Prometheus should not be giving its service account token to everything it scrapes. We can substitute Prometheus for a privileged thing. Like you could probably argue that in most people's cases, it doesn't matter. Prometheus doesn't want every audience it scrapes to be able to talk to every other audience, because that bridges all the audiences that it's given the token to. That is more of a collector type use case. So do we have any other collector type use cases that would deal across nodes? Things like daemon sets, or like Cassandra, like as an example, where you want to talk to a whole bunch of different entities that aren't under the same service account, and act on them without giving each of those entities the same service account token.
I think the Prometheus case is a place where JOTS as a mechanism here starts to break down, because you end up with, an audience explosion, because you need an audience per target that you're talking to, which means that you get very chatty with the JOT minting thing. You have to store a bunch of JOTs, that type of thing. Whereas something that's, certificate based like Spiffy ends up being more distributed, where you don't have to sort of touch back to some central broker to actually start talking to.
You do, but then you still have to distribute certs that are centrally generated. So you
right,
just
but
replacing one distribution problem with another.
Well, no, but the thing is that the number of certs is on the order of the number of workloads. But when you have high connectivity between workloads, the number of certs is workload squared. I mean, the number of JOTs would be workload squared.
But
right?
That's fair, yeah. If you had 10 different types of Prometheus, you'd have...
Right, and so the experience at Google is that as people start building more and more microservices, you get more and more sort of cross-network connectivity, and having to touch back to some central broker every time you need to talk to a new endpoint ends up being really expensive.
So the argument is that we need to do pod identity, and then we need to immediately give pods trust domains with PKI through some mechanism.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things coming out of this is that identity tied to a service account is probably not good enough. So, that's one piece of it. Now, one of the interesting things is that with X509 certificates, audience doesn't matter, because it's really about using the server identity to identify who you're talking about with mutual TLS. And so that really becomes the audience part of it. So audience is not part of the credential that you
Although that is an argument that you would want the identity in those TLS certs to line up as closely as possible with audience in a world where you have to deal with both.
Well, but the identity in the cert is who is presenting it, whereas the audience in a JOT is about who you're handing it to.
Right.
Our idea of identity should be consistent whether we're using X509 or JOTS.
That's all I was trying to say. Yeah, sorry.
Also, token binding will alleviate a lot of the issues that Joe was talking about, and it'll allow us to expand, or I guess collapse the audiences. Maybe we can make all the individual kubelet audiences a single kubelet audience once we have token binding. And I think after Go 1.11, we will have hooks in place to support that and start experimenting with that.
What is token binding? Is this scoping the audience further? It's really kind of a sub-audience?
No.
Or is it a capability thing?
It's binding a key to a key pair, an OAuth key, or an OAuth token to a key pair.
Making JOTS more like X509, where there's a private key.
Okay.
It's rolled out in Chrome browser and I think a couple other browsers, and it's kind of gaining adoption. So hopefully people will start using it more and more, and it mitigates some of the token stealing risks that we've been discussing.
It's part of the TLS client handshake, right? So it's part of it. It's literally a TLS extension that you send.
It doesn't really change the n squared kind of problem, because you're still generating tokens that are bound to individual TLS sessions.
No, I don't think so. But a token is bound to a key pair. That key pair persists for however long. That key pair is used to sign something called exported keying material, which is a hash of the client random, server random, and master secret of the TLS section. So it's actually not bound, the JOTs aren't bound to the channel, but the token binding, which is generated once per TLS connection, is bound to the channel. And it can be, that token binding can be validated against the key pair in the JOT.
So yeah, but it is still like a pairwise ID between any two pair of
the binding,
entities.
but the binding can be generated locally. That's the point.
Yeah, the binding is generated locally.
Oh, okay.
So you get the key material once, you get the JOT once, and then you bind that to a particular session. That's just involves the two parties that are talking.
Yeah, if you guys want to read more about it, there's an RFC.
It took me like 5 times of Mike explaining it to me for me to even understand. So
yeah, I've read the RFC and I obviously don't understand it.
I would confirm that if you want to understand it, just grab Mike for like 15 minutes.
I'm happy to explain it further. I have one other thing I wanted to talk about token review before we go completely off topic. I think there's 2 models of extending token review. One model is to pass audiences in the spec, and the other, and have the API server validate those audiences. The other model is to return audiences in the status. So, for example, you send a token review that the API server does the validation, but skips audience validation and returns somewhere maybe in user info, extra info, or a new field in the token review status the list of audiences that the JOT had, and it is up to the client to validate that.
Are the JOTs encrypted?
No, no.
Then why can't the person that's like trying to get the JOT validated just read the audience directly? Like, it doesn't need the API server to tell it that.
That's true. So
presumably it knows who it is, so it should be able to.
Are you advocating for not using token review at all with these?
No. I mean, you still use token review to tell whether or not the token is authentic. But if I want to validate, is this token for me, then I just look at the audience, and
right.
am I listed in the audience? Then it's fine.
So token review is currently agnostic of the token encoding. So it actually works for like a Google OAuth token. So if a client is treating these as opaque blobs, there's an argument for extracting that information and putting it in user info. In the specific case of the service account ID tokens, I think you are correct that the client can just reach inside the JOT and grab it, but that's not always going to be the case for token review.
Well, are you saying that like the audience is going to be encoded in a different way in different tokens, and the API server is going to normalize that somehow?
Yes, or not even encoded in the token. Like in the case of a Google OAuth token, that is an opaque blob. And
okay, so the person that's trying to determine whether or not the token that was presented to them is authentic can't figure out the audience without the help of the API server.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So
fair enough.
Yeah, it's generic to any flavor of token, or the token review currently is. So I think the main difference between the 2 models is, well, so this would be an API expansion. Current clients of the API, of this token review API, would initially ignore the field, which means that potentially a token that is scoped to a specific audience will be usable against old clients until they're upgraded to start validating validating that extra field in user info. So that's a downside. The first model, I don't know. Does anybody?
What's the? I'm just trying to think through, like, what's the consequence of, like, if someone messes that up? Like if if we pass this thing back and someone doesn't validate, what fails then?
Just means that they can get a token that wasn't meant for them and accept it as valid. They'll happily accept tokens that have audiences that are just not for them.
It also means that if you write your system like this and you don't know that it's broken, and your system is compromised, the tokens that you have in that system can be replayed to the actual audience, the original audience. So I think if you sort of pervasively forget to check audiences everywhere, it leads to a really broken system.
So the tokens that are flowing around today are not audience scoped at all, right?
Correct.
So in the first model where the client that's doing the token request provides the audience, then that's an indication, I am a client that understands audiences. And if it provides the audience, then it can get, the information, or the API can check it. But if you have an old client that doesn't provide the audience, passing you a token that has an audience, then we can fail that authorization and have old clients not accept tokens that are bound to audiences, until they're upgraded to understand audiences.
Yeah, that is definitely a benefit. It complicates the API, but potentially it complicates it in a good way.
Mike, you mentioned an interesting model of like returning something in the status, that if the token review status returned like a maybe, that isn't the same as the yes, this authenticated, but then you had to go through the audience and make the decision for yourself. So you at least had to actively ignore the fact that we weren't giving you an absolute yes on that response. Is there any way we could make the API do something like that?
Yeah, we definitely could. So this is kind of the model where we have this concept with IAM. There exist, I don't know how to best explain this.
There's times where you want to like evaluate extra conditions that only the actual like server knows about. So the central system will say, yeah, this thing looks good to me as long as you validate these other things locally. And so this is a case where you might want to say, this token appears to be, it's signed by the right, like the issuer matches, the signer matches. I have no idea what you care about for the audience. So it's valid if, and then the if is if you're in one of these audiences.
Right. It's like ABAC, but you are distributing the valuation of the expression. So the response returned is this token could not be authenticated, but if you evaluate this expression and true comes out, then it is authenticated, and this is the user info. That is would be a significantly more complex response, but it's definitely possible.
I don't know if you'd have to go all the way to make it a
general
expression in this case. You
right.
could just say yes if audiences.
If we decide not to use a user info change, doesn't it sort of preclude like changes in regards to like service catalog, right? Like they are sending data through user info that you're supposed to process, right? And there was actually a bug where service catalog would not actually send extra data correctly at all. That was recently fixed. So like in OpenShift, we were ignoring scopes being sent to us because they weren't being sent in the right place. So I mean, in general, if you expect extra to be usable by like an authorizer of some sort, right? Like you have to make the assumption that the thing on the other end will pay attention.
Right. That's true. And It definitely simplifies the problem. There is that period where you have old clients that is a little bit frightening to me.
No, I don't disagree with that. I just don't know how you could then ever add anything at all into user extra that wasn't like, if it was additive, it would be fine because you would fail closed. But anything that should restrict your decision is going to get ignored until you understand it's supposed to restrict your decision. So meaning you can never do that, right? So you basically can't use extra then, right? Not in a meaningful way.
For restriction, for
attenuation. For restriction, right? And I mean, it just sort of depends, right? Like we only use extra and like OpenShift as restricting. It's not required per se. It just makes understanding how things will work a lot easier.
Should we just like bump the version on this API or something like that, or whatever the equivalent is? Because it sounds like there's going to be all kinds of interesting backward compatibility issues.
That's a possibility.
Is this an API per se? Like it's not like an API that has versions and stuff, right? It's just headers that, like for example, Service Catalog just sends the originating identity header. Now we would have originating identity header version 2.
The actual token review is.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Token review API.
You're right. Yeah, you could change token review to token review view T that does smarter things, I guess.
Yeah, I'm not. I haven't looked at how Service Catalog does authentication. Does Service Catalog act as a authenticating proxy, and the API server trusts it to delegate identities correctly?
So it depends on the brokers involved. So when you make a request to Service Catalog, it will look at who you are, so your user info, and send that as a header to any broker. And then the broker has to decide what to do with that originating identity if it cares. So like the template service broker, it knows exactly what objects it's working with. So it does like subject access reviews on every single object effectively. It just depends on the broker honoring or trying to do something useful with the identity. Though I think there are plans to move more of that into Service Catalog.
Yeah, that's an interesting use case. I need to look into that. I will go through and I'll try to write up notes on what we discussed. I'll watch the video again. Thank you for the discussion. I think there's some valuable insight learned in this conversation.
So Mike, I'd love to explore this stuff from a scenario point of view in terms of, what are the scenarios? What are we trying to protect? Apply sort of a more traditional sort of threat modeling type of thing. And I'm happy to brainstorm / review stuff along those lines.
Awesome, thanks.
So I think we didn't get Chris joining, so we might have to park that agenda item. So maybe we should call it early, unless someone else wants to spontaneously add to the agenda. I'll take that as a no. All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.